Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mia Burke, and I am Program Manager with Hanford Challenge. Hanford Challenge is a nonprofit based in Seattle that advocates for a safe and effective cleanup of the Hanford nuclear site. And one thing that makes Hanford Challenge unique is that we work closely with insiders, workers, and whistleblowers who have issues that aren't being addressed. This is the 19th webinar of our Nuclear Waste Scholar Series. If you are new to the series, we began it to inspire action and involvement with Hanford Cleanup by inviting movers, shakers, and thinkers to share groundbreaking scholarship, art, research, and experience working with nuclear waste. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, David Bolingbroke. David is an associate historian for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints' Church History Department. He received a PhD in American Environmental History from Washington State University in December of 2020. His research areas include animals, nuclear contamination, environmental restoration, Pacific Northwest agriculture, Nevada fisheries, and Latin American Latter-day Saints history in the 20th century. He is currently working on a book project titled Nuclear Animals, Hanford and a World of Environmental Risk, Contamination, and Restoration. Just as a heads up, David's presentation will be about 40 minutes long, and we will leave time after the presentation for Q&A. If you can't stick around for the whole time, feel free to leave. We will be recording the presentation and we'll share a link of the recording with everyone that registered. Thank you so much for joining us today, David. I'll pass it to you to talk about your work.
Great. Thank you so much, Mia. And thanks so much for the opportunity to talk with everyone about the animals at Hanford. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have some pictures that kind of accompany the conversation today. Okay, so the book that I've been working on, it was a fun time getting to this moment, but around in 2014, I moved to Washington, and I had never lived in Washington before. And so I had all these images in my mind of what the state might be like, and most of the images were associated with Seattle. And then I got to Pullman, Washington, the campus headquarters for Washington State University on the other side of the state, and I thought, this is nothing like the Washington I had imagined. Lots of wheat fields, lots of desert. And I came to study environmental history in the US West. And I never thought that I would end up doing nuclear history as well. But while I was there, someone said, hey, the Department of Energy recently transitioned their archive over to Washington State University's extension in Tri-Cities. You should go out and check out some of those sources. So I did an internship with them, and I started to find all these sources in the archives about animals that nuclear scientists studied at the Hanford nuclear site. And I remember also the first time I visited a museum there in Kennewick, Richland, called the Hanford Reach Museum. And I walked into the museum, and one half of the museum was nuclear technological history. Details about the people that made the bombs and the different instruments and mechanisms that they used to produce plutonium. And then the other half of the museum was the Columbia Basin and its geographical features, and the animals and the ducks and all of the salmon and all of the different creatures that depended on the Columbia River and the associated plateau and river corridor that went alongside it. And I thought, well, that is a stark division between building bombs and between this beautiful natural landscape. Why aren't we telling these two stories together, was what I thought. Like, this is the same place. And so that led me down the road to writing a dissertation and now working on a book about Hanford's nuclear animals. So each of the different slides that I'm going to talk about will feature a different group of animals that scientists studied beginning with World War II in 1943 and 1944 at Hanford up until the closure of the plutonium project in 1989 and 1990, and then the ensuing cleanup project that still continues today in the Tri-Cities. So the first picture here shows a group of women technicians at Hanford working on these little lambs. And so I organized each chapter of the book is organized around a certain set of animals. And what they tell us about Hanford, and that scientists were learning new ecologies from studying radioactivity in the environment. And they were using animals as a medium through which they could open themselves up to a new world of discoveries and a new world of information about risk and radioactivity. So this photograph here shows one of the workers at Hanford, and he looks like he's out duck hunting. So they would shoot ducks, they would bring them in, and they would test them for radioactivity. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get further into this. So for those who haven't been to Hanford, it's a massive nuclear cleanup site to the north of the Tri-Cities in central Washington. So it's over 550 square miles. So this is a massive site. And this map on the right here shows the different facilities that were there, and some are still there as we move into the 21st century. And so right along the Columbia River, the corridor, and then an abrupt lift to the Columbia Basin Plateau, where many of the nuclear waste storage facilities are located. So it was here in 1943 that the federal government and their leading scientists of the Manhattan Project decided this would be the site for producing plutonium in their efforts to build a bomb before the Germans during World War II. And so here at the site, they thought, well, this is pretty isolated. There's not very many people here. We have this massive water source in the Columbia River. The Grand Coulee Dam had just been completed about a decade or so before, so they could pump all that water down, cool the nuclear reactor that they were building, fuel the electricity that they needed to produce. And so that was the place. They moved out the tribes that lived there, the Yakama, the Wanapum, the Nez Perce, who fished for salmon, who gathered along the shores of the Columbia River. They moved out the white American settlements that used the river for irrigation to agricultural crops at White Bluffs and at Hanford. And they said, okay, this is the place. And so they brought in workers from all over the country to build the bomb. Some of the workers noticed what they called the termination winds, or the winds that blew in from the Columbia Basin and brought dust everywhere. And then some of them, like one scientist, Leona Marshall Woods Libby, she noticed the coyotes. And in fact, they would go out while she was there. So while they were working to build the reactor, involved in all this nuclear production, Leona remembers the guards going out and shooting coyotes and then bringing them in to check their thyroids to see if already thinking about, well, how can this new radiation that's entering the environment be affecting the animal and plant life in the area? And so from the very beginning of the project, scientists were concerned about the effect that radioactive contamination could have on animals. And they were particularly worried about salmon. Salmon by then in the state of Washington were in decline, but they were still a really important food fish commercially and symbolically to the Pacific Northwest. So they commissioned a guy that his nickname was Dr. Trout, Loren Donaldson, who was a professor at the University of Washington. And they came to Donaldson and they said, hey, you were one of the foremost experts on fisheries. We would like to do a project that involved testing radioactivity on fish. And so they first set up at the lab at the University of Washington. And they began to test these fish with water that was radioactive. They wanted to know, well, how will the water that's coming from Hanford's reactor after it's cooled and goes back into the Columbia River, how will that water affect the fish? So they studied like many different levels on the salmon and on the trout. And they kind of found that you'd get to this idea of a certain point where enough radioactivity could cause a lot of damage in the fish's bodies. And so not long after, they moved and created a laboratory at Hanford. So Dick Foster, one of Loren Donaldson's students, ran the fish laboratory at Hanford. And they would set up these different troughs you could see in the photo. They were connected to the pipes. They would bring in the water, the effluent water from the reactors, and then they would study on these many types of fish. And so what's really important that comes out out of these early studies on fish is that they realized that radiation moves through the food chain in certain ways. As it gets into the algae, the little fish eat the algae, bigger fish eat the little fish, and then salmon and trout will eat the bigger fish. And so that through that way, that radiation will move through a chain of different bodies in the Columbia River. And so they moved their studies to not just the lab, but the field. And so they made all of the Pacific Northwest their laboratory. And they sent out scientists along the Columbia River, but also along the coast to study and monitor the different animal or the different aquatic animals in the area and see whether or not they could find traces of radioactivity. So Donaldson had a team in Seattle at the university, and then Foster's team at Hanford were doing these monitoring studies in the late 1940s and into the 1950s and 1960s. One of the most interesting studies I think that Donaldson did was he set up a salmon hatchery on campus at the University of Washington. For those of you who've been to Seattle and been to the campus, it's right on the bay there. And so Donaldson set up a little pond on campus where he reared the salmon, made them hot with radiation, sent them back out to the ocean where they hung out, got fat, and then swam back up the little stream and then back into the ponds at the university where he could then test the salmon and see what levels of radiation had affected them from very small amounts to much larger amounts, from ingestion to proximity. And so they're making the Pacific Northwest their laboratory. And one of the fish that they studied in the Columbia River at Hanford was they were studying trout, but what they realized is that different radioactive particles could present more of a danger if they were taken up into the body of the fish. And so one of the ones that they were particularly concerned about was phosphorus 32. So P32 could get into the flesh of the fish and then could present a problem to people if they ate enough of it, they thought. And so, which fish had P32 in them? Well, they would test the trout. And so here, this one shows here that they would look at the bone, the liver, the muscle. And these are the ones that they would intentionally feed the P32 in the laboratory. And then they'd say, okay, after that feeding, what's the concentration like? And one of the important scientific pieces of knowledge that was developed at Hanford and other places, and especially at Hanford, though, because of the aquatics laboratory, was that they realized that certain radioactive particles concentrated as they moved through the food chain, or they could become more potent as they became concentrated in the fish's bodies by the end. So the fish that are drinking the water through their gills, that are eating the other items that have radioactivity, they could end up concentrating that source inside their body. And so one particular fish that they thought might be a problem was whitefish, because they found out that, in the Columbia River, the water was pretty cold. And so, but then you're releasing all of this effluent water from the reactor into the river. And so what that did is it created warm spots in the river. And so warm water fish species would be more likely to go into those areas. So fish like suckers, fish like carp, they would suck up more of the effluent water than fish like trout and salmon. Or the other fish that were getting a little more of it were fish that were bottom feeders. So fish like the whitefish. So the whitefish is a native fish to the Columbia River, but it's not a super popular fish. Like those suckers and carp, a lot of American fishermen at the time in the 1940s and 1950s, now these are trash fish. Nobody wants to eat sucker fish. Nobody wants to eat carp, they thought. But many native people in the area did have a long history of fishing for native sucker fish. Carp, lots of people in the world like carp. But because they were considered a trash fish by like the white American community, they weren't as concerned about those fish. But whitefish, while they weren't like a popular sport fish like rainbow trout or like Pacific salmon, people really like to eat whitefish. And local fishermen around Tri-Cities like to eat whitefish. So one of the biologists working at Hanford, he thought, well, can whitefish be a problem? Could people get sick from eating whitefish? And so he determined that he'd do a little experiment on himself. He tried to eat as much whitefish as he could. He was trying to build up a body burden or build up a certain level of radioactivity that could present a threat. But he wasn't able to eat enough fish to reach the threshold that he thought would put him in danger. And so it wasn't just fish, though, that they were studying at Hanford, but learning what was going on with the Columbia River, and then whether or not that could present a danger to residents in the area was a source of concern and a source of study. So beyond what they're doing with aquatics, the scientists at Hanford also opened up an animal farm. So around 1948, 1949, they opened up this animal farm where they could test radioactivity in a controlled setting on these different farm animals. So they had sheep, they had goats, they had pigs. And then they would try to figure out, well, okay, we have this atomic project that's going on across the nation, across the world, but more specifically, they're worried about the United States livestock industry. And they thought, well, let's see how different sources of radiation can affect farm life. And then they also had a program where they were, like I said, they were going out and they were collecting ducks, because there's all these holding ponds on the Hanford site where like the water, the wastewater just kind of sitting around after the plutonium production process. Because when they're getting the slugs out of the reactor, like they had to sit and they had to cool for quite a long time. And then lots of waste was created as a result of this, including these kind of waste holding ponds. So ducks, they'd come in, they'd fly in down the Pacific Flyway. Hanford in central Washington is located right on a migratory waterfowl route. And so they would see the ducks come in. Sometimes they'd try to scare the ducks, try to get them off the ponds, but then they would also test them and try to figure out, well, where are these birds going? So they tracked some of them down to Mexico, California, and these were birds that were carrying radiation with them. And so with the sheep, what happened with the sheep was that Hanford gets pulled into this larger world of radiation fallout studies. So in the 1950s, the United States begins to test several bombs in the Nevada desert at the Nevada test site. And so they're testing these bombs outside to the west of communities in Utah, like Parowan and Cedar City and St. George. I was just down in St. George earlier this week, and I talked to them about, people that were affected by nuclear testing in the Southwest. And one person, she raised her hand and she said, yeah, I'm a downwinder. I'm here today. And so lots of people were living in those areas. They were watching the testing that's going on. And some of the people that lived in the Cedar City area and some other communities in Utah, they were sheep herders. The sheep herding industry in the 1930s and 1940s was a big industry in Nevada and in Utah. And these Utah farmers, they would herd their sheep onto leased lands in Nevada, and then they'd bring them back in seasonally when the time was right. But they noticed that several of their sheep were dying. And they weren't the only ones. People in New Mexico were noticing that their cattle were dying or were diseased. And so the sheep farmers thought, well, what could be causing this? Well, they knew that their sheep had been grazing in proximity to the Nevada test site. And they thought, well, that has to be it. It has to be that they got sick because of radiation exposure. So these farmers sued the federal government and the Atomic Energy Commission. So the Atomic Energy Commission was the regulatory federal commission created to govern sites like Hanford and their use of atomic energy. So they're overseeing what's going on in Los Alamos, Hanford, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and many other places. And at the Nevada test site, they had to prove, then the farmers had to make a case that it was the radiation that killed our sheep. And so the Atomic Energy Commission turned to scientists at Hanford, and they said, well, we need evidence in our case against the farmers. And so we need to figure out whether or not it was radiation fallout from the Nevada test site that caused the death of these livestock. So they commissioned them to do a series of studies at Hanford on the sheep at the Hanford Animal Farm. So Leo Bustad, who was a veterinary professor from Washington State University, or later on he goes to Washington State University, but he might have been also teaching at the time. I'm a little hazy on that. But Bustad, he goes in and he's taking over the sheep study at Hanford. And they say, okay, let's have the sheep eat grass and other food material, pellets that have radioactivity. Let's put up something up against them, see what it's like when they're exposed to surface level radioactivity, and try to figure what's going on. So this picture right here shows one of these sheep at Hanford. And you can see he has the little cap and radiation source attached to its skin. And so they had a control group, and then they had various levels. And they eventually thought, you know, based on our studies here, based on the numbers that we have here in the lab, I don't think there was enough radiation to kill those sheep in Nevada that belong to the farmers in Utah. And so this is something you see crop over and over again during this era, is scientists working for the Atomic Energy Commission, determining that, well, these people who are saying their animals died, it couldn't have been from fallout. It's just not enough. They couldn't have been getting enough ingestion or enough proximity to create that kind of damage, because our numbers in the lab show that it takes quite a bit of radiation to kill these sheep, to harm these sheep that we're testing here. Well, what was the problem with that? The problem was that the lab was a very controlled setting, whereas the field had a lot of different factors at play. Whether it's hot spots, so places where like the radiation concentrates much higher than the surrounding landscape, whether it's emissions blowing certain ways with the wind, there's a lot of factors. Whether it's malnourishment, some of those sheep in Nevada probably weren't super well fed compared to the ones that are here in the farm and that are being fed by hand by these workers at Hanford. So they trusted their numbers, but over and over again, the numbers failed to support the victims of atomic fallout. So the second chapter focused on those sheep. But more than just locally, Hanford scientists are also getting involved in tracking global fallout, radiation around the world. So Lauren Donaldson, the scientist from the University of Washington, he was hired to go to the South Pacific and study the ocean fish and ocean creatures that were affected by the testing in the Marshall Islands. And then they also brought him in for some like cleanup duty when they had to try to convince Japanese fishermen that the tuna industry was not in danger. The Lucky Dragon, when it comes into the path of one of the tests, and a lot of those fish and people become contaminated on that fishing ship in the early 1960s, where they sent Donaldson to talk to people in Japan and try to get them, hey, to not worry, to say, oh, don't worry, your fish are going to be safe. And so the scientists from Hanford also go to Alaska in the early 1960s. It was part of a project that the federal government was doing called Project Chariot. They had plans to build an artificial harbor in Alaska. So in advance of those plans, they sent a group of scientists from Hanford to study radioactive fallout in Alaska. And it was quite interesting what they found. They found that in Alaska, caribou and reindeer and native people, that they found that was a pathway for radiation entering the bodies of people, was through the caribou that people were eating, because the caribou were eating moss and lichen that was contaminated. So fallout was reaching all the way in Alaska. Fallout's going across the world. And Hanford scientists are learning that they're part of a much larger project. And in fact, they found that there was a danger, but they did find that with some of these particles, like here they're looking at in this graph, they're looking at the lichen, and they're looking for trying to track how much per grams ash weight they found of these particular particles. I have another one here that I wanted to talk a little bit more about. Let's go back to this one. And so I think they found that the bone area was a place where the radioactivity was concentrating, was becoming more dense. And the scientists at Hanford thought, well, it's a good thing that people don't eat the bones. But they probably weren't thinking that, well, native people will eat the bones of the caribou, because they use like most of the different parts of the caribou and the moose and the reindeer. And so eventually, native people and environmentalists teamed up together to say, we don't want the Project Chariot to happen. Their fears about radioactivity prevented, and the protests prevented that project from coming to be. Okay, so one of my chapters also looks at people and sees people at Hanford, the workers themselves, as the nuclear animals. That being at Hanford changed something about the people who worked there, or it created a specific culture. I think Leona Marshall Woods Libby, the scientist who worked on the Manhattan Project, she called them uranium people. But I like to think of them here as nuclear people. So these are people that worked at Hanford for so long that, and this wasn't necessarily their bodies were changed, which sometimes they were, like sometimes they got sick of cancer and other things, but it's also a culture that develops around the workers who are in close proximity to low-level radioactivity. So I'd like to share a little story from Harry Kornberg. So Harry Kornberg was the head of the biology department at Hanford in the 1950s. And I'll share a little passage from my book here. It says, some of the most interesting radioactive experiments Hanford biologists conducted were on themselves. On a quiet Saturday morning in the early 1950s, Harry Kornberg, head of the Hanford biology department, found himself trapped near the Columbia River wearing only his shorts. Kornberg had not gone out for a swim that morning and accidentally locked himself out of his car, nor was he at a public park or a popular swimming hole on the Columbia River. He was at the Hanford nuclear site. There he stood, locked in a glass box filled with radioactive tritium oxide, connected to an inhalation tube that was not working, and he was in need of a little assistance. He frantically called for his colleague, Chester DeLong, to increase the airflow into the box. His friend swiftly complied, but this time the flow was too high, making Kornberg feel like a balloon. Undeterred, he sped up his breathing to match the increased airflow until finally DeLong managed to find the right intake speed. Crisis averted. Roughly an hour later, Kornberg left the box unscathed and proceeded to go about his day. He had just volunteered and participated in an experiment to determine the rate of body absorption for tritium oxide. So Kornberg, he wanted to figure out, well, how could tritium oxide be sneaking in through workers' masks who worked at these nuclear facilities? And he thought the best way to do that would be to go in on a weekend when nobody was around and conduct this experiment on himself. So these stories like this, like Kornberg's story, show that living and working in this type of situation created almost a casual attitude for some employees around low-level radiation. But others, a few others showed that there was a lot of fear also when it came to living in that kind of and working in that kind of an environment. So some of the other stories associated with that are Jerry Davis tells a story, a Hanford biologist, who one day he was noticing that like a piece of driftwood up from the Columbia River with moss on it, or with a rope. It was actually a rope, that's right. He saw a rope protruding from this piece of driftwood, and they tested it, and it had really high levels of radiation. He thought, well, that's when he realized that, oh, maybe if things are at the surface, they're going to absorb more. So when he was in Alaska on those studies, he was in a tree or near a tree, and he saw like a piece of lichen moss that was protruding like from the end of a branch. So he cut off that moss and he thought, I'm going to take this back to the office with me. So he takes it back to the office, puts it on his desk. Well, they come in and test it, and they got mad at him because the levels of radioactivity in that piece of moss were too high for it to be just sitting there on his desk. And so this kind of feeling that, well, low-level radiation, because we've been doing all these studies and seeing that it takes a certain amount, they kind of thought, oh, a little bit more casually about this. Another kind of example is one of the scientists who was studying the effect of radiation on rats. And he goes, I was really impressed. We kept feeding the rats more and more, and it didn't faze them at all. They were just getting fat and plump. So this idea that animal testing can create kind of this casual attitude, and that they see that the animals that they're feeding are doing okay. So maybe they think, oh, well, people will be fine as long as it's a low enough level as well. And so then the second to last chapter of my book takes a look then at beagles and eagles in the 1970s. So Hanford is growing from a biological department. Initially, they start off with like around a few employees. I think they have like 50 in 1950. Maybe that doubles by like 1964. And then they're able to split into an ecology department and a biology department. And the ecology department begins to do more like wildlife studies. And this is where I draw a distinction between the different types of animal experiences at Hanford. And that chapter is beagles and eagles, a little wordplay, but looking at two animals that were important to the 1970s, and then eagles in the 1980s at Hanford. And the beagles were brought in as part of a dog testing program that didn't just exist at Hanford. It was also at the University of Utah, another location where they found that dogs, beagle dogs specifically, were well-mannered, well-behaved dogs, easy to train. They were the kind of size that made them like an animal that you could compare to a person. Like, we don't think of it that way, but they're mammals. They have a lot of the same bodily functions that we have as people. And so they wanted to test these dogs at Hanford on inhaled plutonium. Some of the dogs at other locations, they would have a testing program that focused on a different area of exposure. But the dog colony at Hanford, they were putting them up to these masks and having them inhale this plutonium vapor or gas. And they wanted to know, well, what does plutonium do to the lungs and to the respiratory system? And so this was kind of a really tragic story of the dogs. Some were spared because they were in the control group. Others were given high doses and died. And so the scientists are developing relationships with these animals all the while they test them and torture them. And so it creates a complicated area. And in fact, one of the scientists got a little sensitive when locals said, hey, like, some local environmentalists said, we don't like the idea of you guys doing this to the beagles. He kind of responded like, well, our beagles live longer than pet beagles. They live safer and they live happily and they listen to classical music. So these beagles are doing a lot better than those beagles out in the yards that are not being exercised and are being run over by suburban cars. So there was a little defensiveness when those accusations come in. But at the same time, in the biology department, they're looking at beagles. In the ecology department, they're studying the bald eagles at Hanford. And they start to notice that more bald eagles are coming around, using the Hanford area as roosting ground. This is during a period of time in which eagles were threatened. Like nowadays, we see quite a few bald eagles. I see them all the time up here in eastern Idaho, and I go visit my parents, and you can see quite a few in Washington as well. But beagles were more scarce during the 60s and 70s period. But as conservation measures and as the environmentalist movement and the conservation movement pick up steam in the 60s and 70s, eagles become more important at Hanford because the Hanford scientists notice that they're making a return. And then they need to develop measures in which they can show the federal government, after the passage of the Endangered Species Act in the early 70s, that they're going to manage and protect the eagles that come onto the site. So here we see a different pathway where wild animals are protected at Hanford while domestic animals are tested and tortured. And that kind of culminates in the story of the elk. And I love this story. And so elk at Hanford, before Hanford was built, before they began producing plutonium, elk were not there. Elk had been in the area probably before the 1830s, but by like the 1840s, they'd been hunted out. And by the mid-20th century, scientists thought that elk in the Columbia Basin could not coexist. Until the mid-1970s, when one of the ecologists at Hanford noticed that there were 14 elk on the site. Where did they come from? First, they noticed their tracks, and then they located the herd itself. 14 of them. They thought, what is going on here? Well, it turns out that the federal government, or the federal wildlife department, had taken some elk from a herd in Yellowstone, in Wyoming, in Montana. And they'd taken some of those elk and they'd sent them to the Cascades just west of Yakima to try to reintroduce elk into the Cascade Mountains. And the herd was doing pretty well. And so 14 of them decided to go start their own herd. And they snuck through the river corridor of the Yakima River between Yakima and Tri-Cities, Washington, probably at nighttime, very stealthy, and they just showed up at Hanford. Why Hanford and why now? So the scientists thought, well, what could this be? Because Hanford aren't supposed to live here. But then the herd began to grow and grow and grow. And it went to numbers of 500, 700, 800. And now the scientists go, oh, I guess the Columbia Basin is okay for elk. Maybe they can do well here. Previously, they thought that, well, elk need mountains. They need mountains and they need forests because that's where they get their forage in the foothills during the summertime. And then in the wintertime, they come down into the valleys to get out of the snow. But they need that cover, keeps them safe, protects them from predators, gets them in the shade during the hot summer. But the Columbia Basin didn't have those things. Very few trees, no mountains. But what it did have was this massive, over 500-foot square area of undeveloped land and one of the last remaining native sagegrass areas because of that undevelopment. And that was called the Arid Lands Ecology Reserve. So they came onto the Arid Lands Ecology Reserve and they found a home. But as their population exploded, now people are going, well, what do we do with these elk? Because they're going onto orchards, they're eating apples, they're trespassing onto people's private property, and they're just growing and growing. And so they brought in fish and game officials and they did a transplant. And it had to be a helicopter rodeo. So they brought in helicopters, they herded them up, and then they tried to get them into the pen. Well, there was a breakout, a couple of animals died, but eventually they were successful and they moved some animals to the Blue Mountains in southeastern Washington, and then some up further into northern Washington. But the indigenous people, the Umatilla in the Blue Mountains, they were a little wary about accepting this new elk herd because they had come from Hanford, because these animals had been eating in areas that were exposed to radioactivity. And so that Hanford elk, they're not native, but they're not native. They're somewhere in between. And they exemplify that Hanford is a new nuclear place, that these are nuclear animals. They can only exist in the circumstances that they do because of their connection to the nuclear landscape. And so this brings up all kinds of questions. What does it mean to restore a contaminated landscape? Is the project that the Department of Energy is doing to clean up the area, to create the kind of place where people can use and become involved again with these resources, is it feasible? Like, can we ever go back to a pre-nuclear age? And the animals provide a window for understanding the complications. And that Hanford isn't just a wildlife refuge, but it's also a radioactive site. It's both, and they coexist together. And now I'll take any questions that you have. Oh, I do have one more picture here. I really like this. Oh, yeah. So here this shows that the elk, one of the problems they also present is that workers have to avoid them because they're on the roads. So you have some accidents. And then if someone's fortunate, they can go and see the elk in the backdrop of the nuclear buildings. And then one final picture. Oh, here's the article that the scientists published in 1976 announcing the discovery of the elk at the Hanford site. We believe they wandered from the onto the L Reserve from the Cascade Mountains more than 60 miles to the west. Protective isolation, abundant forage, and drinking water now make the treeless L Reserve acceptable. And so all those things were provided because of the location in Hanford. Here shows the growth. So in 1975, you start very small, explode, and then have a more sustainable kind of plateau after that. So today there's still, over 500 elk at the site. One more picture. And it's a reminder that despite the wildlife sanctuary, it's still a nuclear site. Oh, and I love this picture of the monkey. Quick monkey story. At one point, scientists at Hanford, or I can't remember if it was specifically them or just scientists as part of the Atomic Energy Commission, they lost a monkey in the Los Angeles airport. So they had to track it down. I think that would have been pretty funny. But they did have a monkey here at Hanford, and someone thought they would take this funny photo of a monkey next to the General Electric guidebook. All right, thank you. Now I'll take any questions.
Thank you so much, David, for all of your stories. I so appreciate learning more about this topic. Please, anyone, put your questions in the chat or use the Q&A feature, and I will read them off. And just to get us started, do you have any stories about mishaps? The labs seem like this very controlled setting, but we are dealing with animals here, and I'm just wondering if there's any kind of mishap stories that of things gone awry with the scientists and the animals.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Here's the first one that came to my mind. And so the biologists like needed a way to catch fish. It's like they had to become fishermen, the ones that were studying the effect of radioactivity on the fish in the Columbia River. And so one day they were down by the river doing like some surveying, and they came across a dead horse in the water. Just kind of a gruesome scene. Probably probably a horse from like a local rancher that had gotten sick and died, or just old and died. And it was just there kind of rotting at the bank of the river. And inside the horse were all these maggots. So, the typical person might think, I'm going to flee this situation, going to run away quickly. This is terrible. But they thought, maggots, fish bait. So they collected all the maggots, they took them back to the lab, and then they laid them out like on a table in the lab to let them dry. Because once the maggots dried, they'd be in a good shape to go out and use as bait. Well, when they came back the next Monday, there was a swarm of flies like in the lab. All the maggots had hatched. So it was just a terrible like scene inside there. So that's one mishap that comes to mind. Yeah.
That's pretty bad. Thank you. What's one of the most surprising facts or stories you've heard about or encountered during your work?
Yeah, one of the most surprising is, and some of you might have heard it before, but I'm sure many haven't, is the story of the alligators in the Columbia River. And so in 1962, a couple scientists in the biology department thought, oh, no one's really done very many studies on reptiles and exposure to radiation. So they purchased some alligators from the southeast, around 30 of them, just little juvenile, little fellers, about 2 to 3 feet long or so. And they pinned them up inside a cage, and they were kind of waiting to do tests on them. Well, then one of the alligators got out. And what did he do? Like any good gator, he thought, gotta find water. So he went straight to the Columbia River, was swimming around in there, and lo and behold, he was hungry. Guess they hadn't been feeding him well enough. And so he tried to eat a fisherman's bait, and the fisherman caught him. And the fisherman was super excited. And he took it in and he had it stuffed. But the people at Hanford, they found out, and they went and they confiscated his alligator and said, sorry. And then later on, the alligators got out again, and it was a whole hullabaloo trying to track them down. So I thought alligators in the Columbia River, that surprised me.
Yeah, that's a good one. Were the results of the AEC tests, whether on tuna or caribou or sheep, ever covered in any of the newspapers, even with the false reassurance messaging?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to think the tuna, I think the tuna story was covered in the news, and I think it would have had probably that false reassurance. I don't know about the caribou. Well, there was an article that talked about Hanford scientists going to do the studies. I don't know if they gave any like data associated with that, but they did say Hanford, men pierced the Arctic Circle. And there was a news article about it that I remember seeing.
Can you talk about the research you did for this book, and what archives did you find most useful?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I went to several different archives. I think the most useful was probably the Hanford History Project in Tri-Cities. And there, Washington State University, they have the Department of Energy's archival collection for the Hanford site. So that was the one that I used the most. But I also went and looked at like Atomic Energy Commission type stuff at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and then also took a trip to the National Archive Extension in Atlanta. Did some research in Seattle at the University of Washington's collections on their radio ecology lab there, the lab that was led by Donaldson. And then also did a little bit of research that most of it didn't go into the vast majority of it didn't go into the book, but I might use later. At the University of Colorado has an Atomic West collection that has a lot of information on downwinders.
Okay.
So those are some of the places that I went.
Okay. So a few related questions. Are the elk tagged and tracked currently? And what are the radiation levels in the elk? Are you seeing illnesses or death of these animals?
Yeah, and so I think I'm sure they're being monitored by probably like PNNL scientists, I would imagine. And when I was studying them back in the 70s and 80s, I don't remember them really studying them much then. Like I do remember seeing like that the ones that died in the roundup, they did have those tested because they were dead and it was a lot easier to test them. And then they donated those to the Wanapum tribe, which ate them. They did like test deer and they didn't find like high levels in deer. So but yeah, that's a really good question about the elk. I'm not sure if because elk are so hard to manage, they're such a large animal. I think it was difficult for them to get the elk like on hand to be able to do those kind of studies.
Okay. Yeah. How have the insights gained from from Hanford changed the conservation effort in the last 80 years?
Yeah. And so I think what they learn at Hanford is pretty valuable. And some of the things they learn about how radiation is ingested, like those go into the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963 because scientists pushed for them to include ingestion as a pathway. So that was important. And then when it comes to like conservation, is that you have all these places like Hanford. So I did a presentation the other day where we talked about the Desert National Wildlife Refuge and the White Sands National Wildlife Refuge and the Rocky Flats Wildlife Refuge. All of these former atomic sites, because they don't allow private development, they do become like these centers for the study of wildlife and reserves for the preservation of wildlife. And so in that sense, and also what they're learning as far as like how radiation moves through the food chain, when Rachel Carson writes Silent Spring, like she's relying on science of invisible things moving through the food chain, things like DDT. That's like very similar style science to what's being produced by the radio ecologists who are tracking radiation as it moves.
Were any decomposers or scavengers, such as worms or hawks, included in studies with notable observations?
That's a great question. None that I can think of off the top of my head. I didn't see any of those types of studies, but that doesn't mean they don't exist because they were doing a lot of different types.
What are your plans to publish your book?
Yeah, that's a good question. So right now I'm working with the University of Washington Press, and I sent a manuscript to them, doing some revisions. So hopefully in the next few years.
It's very exciting. Can you explain what Project Chariot is?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as the United States began to think about what are ways that we can use atomic energy that don't involve atomic bombs, a guy named Edward Teller had this idea of Project Plowshare. And this was like using atomic energy for peaceful means. And so Project Chariot was they planned to build a harbor in Alaska. And the way that they would create that harbor would be by detonating an explosion in the water that would then create a crater that could allow the water to come in, and then they could have this artificial harbor there. So that was the plan. But the fears and the protests surrounding the fallout of that detonation ended up shutting the plan down, and it was never finished.
Yeah, thank you. When the fish were irradiated and sent out into the wild where they tagged, would fishermen realize that the tag meant not to eat it? And would they obey that or sell the fish anyway?
The fish were not tagged, not in any way that, as far as I know, that fishermen could identify whether or not that fish had been in Hanford scientists' hands. But they would go out and they'd go down to Ringgold. So Ringgold's like a popular area downstream of Hanford where people would fish. And they would survey like fishermen's catches. So they wanted to know if the fish that they were catching could present a health problem. But the thing with you can never monitor enough so that you would catch everything. And it's like I did a visit with a local radiation monitor, and they kind of explained this to me. It's like we only can look at like a little bit. We can never look at everything. So all it takes is like one fish with a body burden or with a high enough level to present problems. But what are your chances of actually finding and monitoring that fish? It's like a needle in a haystack. And so this false faith in the data can sometimes lead people to blind spots, to missing that they're just never going to be able to fully monitor in such a way that they catch everything.
Yeah. Do you know what the biological concentration factors they found as radionuclides moved up the food chain?
Yeah, so the main, and I'm not an expert on all the science about this, but the main thing that they found was that the levels, as they moved up, so they could concentrate into higher amounts, like into higher doses than that they originally started at as they moved through the food chain.
Okay. Is there any, I mean, you talked about the alligators getting loose into the river, but the one and then getting caught by the fishermen. But can you tell the rest of the story? Would you mind?
Yeah. And so after the first escape, they were a little embarrassed because the fishermen, like it was in the news and they caught them off guard. And so they went and they like tapped down the pins, they made sure that they were secure. And the original scientist who began the study, he was gone by then. So Bill Baer, who was one of the biologists at Hanford, he took over the project after that. And like 4 of them escaped, including one or two that were radioactive that they'd already begun testing. And so then they were like, oh, what do we do? And they thought, well, we don't want to be caught off guard, but we don't want someone to find one of these alligators like they did last time. So they leaked the story to the Herald, to the Tri-City Herald, and they said, we had some alligators that got out. Like, don't worry, we're gonna go out and find them. Like you can post the story. And so they did that, and then they sent out like a search for the alligators. And they recovered a couple of them, but they never recovered all of them. So then years later, like I think it was one of the scientists who wasn't around at the time, he said, I went to a bar one night and like a guy was talking about seeing an alligator down by the Columbia River. He was like, could it be? Could one of those alligators have survived? And he's like, oh, it's just bar talk.
Such a great story. Thank you. Did any of the AEC DOE use animal studies in the case of downwinders in Franklin County?
Is that Franklin County, Washington?
I believe so.
Well, the animal that they would have been most concerned with would have been cows in that case. And so they were testing cows, but by the time people found out about the lawsuit was much later. And so I don't know if any animals were involved in that lawsuit. But they had been testing the like cow milk and things like that at some point.
Do they ever not do any testing of the elk because they really don't want to know the results?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know for sure. Like I would like to learn myself more about what's currently going on with the elk. but they could, sometimes you don't want to find what you're afraid of. So I can't say for sure though.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, so Benjamin Sovacool did a study several years ago on accidents in nuclear power plants. At least one of them involved mice munching on some cables in the control room and creating havoc. Was there any pest control at the Hanford Works?
Yeah, that's a great question. What a story. Hmm. I I didn't come across anything about pest control, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, I'm thinking of problems with flies, like fruit flies have been an issue at Hanford because they can carry like little pieces of radiation with them. They did have a mice colony at Hanford, so they had a dog colony. Their other big like test subjects were mice. So there were
Okay.
a lot of lab mice at Hanford.
Yeah, but none munching on cable.
Not munching on wires that I've heard of, but I wouldn't surprise me. That's a cool story.
Um, do the I guess Alaska natives eat caribou, and has anyone tested the caribou meat or organs?
Yeah, they had tested it in the early 1960s. I don't know if they're currently testing it,
Mhm.
but during that time in which Hanford was releasing a lot of emissions, they did go up and they tested the caribou, and they did find that some of them had radioactivity, and they also did find that some. I mean, it was enough of a threat that one kind of story that I saw in the archives was someone made like a morbid joke to a new employee, and they were like, "Do you know that freezer over there? Like that freezer has dead bodies, like from Alaska, from people that died." And like it was a joke, like a morbid joke, but the person, like it gave them enough of a fright that like they did know that like this could, in the right circumstances, present a problem.
Have there been any remediation or acknowledgement to all the people unknowingly exposed who have eaten these nuclear animals, or are the levels low enough to not cause issues?
I think usually the levels are low enough to not cause issues. But the thing with radiation is you never quite know. Like the verdict is, in my understanding, is the verdict is still out over what the effects of low-level long-term exposure are. So the only people that have been compensated for their losses are people in the downwinder or worker compensation suits. But how does a downwinder prove that their cancer came from eating contaminated meat versus it coming from inhaling or another source? And so it's always difficult to prove those kinds of things.
Yeah. I'm gonna read a couple of comments from people who worked at Hanford. I worked at Hanford from 1969 to 2017, and once was in the 329 building counting room when hawk poop was being counted. The gamma radiation was very high. Preliminary Geiger counter reading was third scale and beeping like crazy. I don't know what nuclides were present. And then from Vince, who's a former Hanford
There's
worker.
our hawk question answered.
Yeah, yeah. Mice were a continuous problem and resulted in many stories. As hard as we worked to control mice, millions of field mice lived outside our fences and kept moving in. Um, a Hanford biologist straight-faced told a news reporter that there were carnivorous deer on the Hanford reservation. The reporter wrote up a story that was reviewed, stopped by the editor. The editor reported the incident to the Battelle authorities, and the biologist was disciplined.
Oh wow. Whoops. Taking
Those are
advantage of
great
a gullible
stories.
reporter.
Yeah, great stories.
But maybe that I'll just make a point, and I've been thinking about this. When we think of like animals affected by radioactivity, I think the public would be more likely to think of the carnivorous deer or the mutated lizard than they would just think about like the many different animals that are out at places like Hanford, Chernobyl, the Nevada test site, that they're taking up like little levels of radiation. Not enough that it's causing like noticeable mutations, but it's to think about these animals that we want to envision as pristine, like the elk. They're really not pristine. Like they are a part of this kind of messy atomic world that we live in. and we share it with them.
Yeah. Do you have any, I guess we can end on this one. Do you have any general conclusions about animal testing at Hanford?
Yeah, great question. General conclusions. I think it's that in order to understand Hanford's future with animals, is that animal testing has to be a part of the story. It can't be something that we sweep under the rug and just want to forget about because, thinking about beagles dying from exposure to plutonium isn't nice. But those would be the kind of stories that we tell alongside triumphant or critical narratives about the site, is also the day-to-day experience of what it was like being a living creature at Hanford.